Hello, hello, hello. It is Jackie Petite Home with Julian, my wonderful co-host. Julian, how are you this morning?
I'm good, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll jump into it. Jackie, what are we covering today?
Today, we are talking about the presidential campaign, right? But the part that applies in our world, right? So it's Thursday that we're recording this. Happy Halloween if you're listening to anyone or if you celebrate. But we're going to be talking about the two different tax platforms, right, of our major candidates because the election is just in a couple days. So welcome, episode 12. We did it. We're here. So we're going to cover the individual tax rates, capital gains, estate and gift tax, and business taxes, and also some action items that you should do as we prepare to see a possible sunset of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So let's get right back into it. So the first thing is individual tax rates, right? So if for those who might be listening for the first time, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed by the Trump administration. And what are some of the changes we will see, Julian, if it does sunset at the end of 2025?
Correct. And the status quo is that it will sunset barring anything being passed in Congress, right? It's expected to sunset. So what that means is the highest tax rate jumping from 37 to 39.6%. So that's a big shift for high earners. Across the board, though, for tax rates below that, it does jump between 2 and 4%. So I would say on average about 3 if you're looking at as far as effective tax rates. So we've been talking about this for the past 18 months, 2 years or so, as far as last year, this year, and next year being great years to take advantage of lower tax rates, barring any changes made to the TCJA or extensions or anything like that. So both candidates have different plans here as far as extending it, putting in new laws or not. Jackie, you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah. So, what we've been doing with a lot of the families we serve is saying, hey, it might sunset. So let's take advantage of just this lower tax bracket. And that might be Roth conversion or making a bigger distribution, right, from retirement accounts if they will have a big expense, things like that. But yeah, so just know, folks, that the brackets will expand and we might be in a higher bracket starting 2026 if it does indeed sunset.
Exactly. And we have a few folks retired or retiring. So these are some good years to make those Roth conversions or delay Social Security and take advantage of lower tax rates up until 2026. Because if you're in the 24% bracket now, you'll likely be in the 28% bracket then. If you're in the 22% bracket now, you'll likely be in the 25% bracket then. So these things are moving. It's important to take advantage of that. For the families that work with us, we have been discussing this at length and reviewing incomes and investments around it. But this will change unless they choose to extend it or they just allow it to expire.
Yeah. And so a lot of uncertainty, and that's why we see, a lot of folks concerned because we don't know what's going to happen, right? So the next piece is the capital gains and dividends, right? So there's going to be some expected changes for those who don't know. Capital gains are taxed at the 20% for the highest income earners. And there are talks of increasing that if it does sunset. So, Julian, how do you see this impacting, especially high income earners, and what changes might come about for the capital gains?
So when you think about it, and just for reference, capital gain, you buy a stock, you buy Apple, you hold it for longer than a year, and then you sell it, right? That would be a long-term capital gain. That is taxed right now at 0, 15, or 20%, depending on your income through the year. So if essentially Kamala wins the election and they elect to make changes to this, and this is her platform, that could increase to as much as your overall income rate. So if you're at in the future 39.6% rate, your taxes, your gains would double. Your taxes on your gains would double, essentially from 20 to nearly 40%. So it does very much affect tax planning. It does very much affect optionality going forward. Whereas when you look at the Trump administration, their platform, they're not looking to make changes to this. They're seeing it staying at that 20% for now. Jackie, does it affect folks' dividends? What do you think it does there?
Yeah, this can also affect folks that are getting qualified dividends or just relying on any form of investment income. Because if we can see there's talks, right, of the capital gains potentially jumping up to 40% or even as high as just your regular income, this can affect a lot of individuals across the board, right? So if you already think your personal tax bracket, it might be a little bit higher than now. If you're a high income earner, your capital gains are higher. We just might have just an overall tax drag on your investments and like your long-term return on things. So if you do rely on dividend income, you want to pay attention to this because it might affect you. So yeah, taxes, they affect everybody, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do personal position, if you're willing to take the risk, you should get the bulk of the return. So I would like to see this stay the same, leads to optionality for a lot of the folks we work with, a lot of the families we serve. Whereas, as taxes get higher on risk assets, I would call them, right? Assets where folks are putting their net worth into a lot of different stocks across the US and abroad. Then when they sell it at a gain, right, it should be lower. But that's my personal position. Because they're taking the risk, and nobody else.
And that's also a good point because you think about the incentives for people to hold on to stock long term, right? We have a few folks who have stocks that have tremendous gains, and some of it's been, hey, let's wait after that year-long kind of trigger to sell the investment because your impact to your tax will be lower. So yeah, I don't know. A lot of these things, I forgot what you said on one of the podcasts, right? At the end of the day, like the government is inept or something. I remember, I don't want to misquote you, but if these things pass,
Ineffective. I wouldn't say inept. There are a lot of great people that work in government, but there's so much red tape that it is hard to make any legitimate changes long term. And the only time things move in unison is when something went really wrong, like COVID or any attacks in the past or anything like that. But for the most part, they just fight over. Some would say nothing, and it continues endlessly. But the people that work in government, great politicians. I could be convinced they could be much better.
Oh yeah, that's also yes, not government. I mean, folks are trying to pass laws. That's let me thank you for clearing that up. Yeah, because it's more about arguing and being right versus coming together and collaborating. But I'm gonna get off my soapbox. So the third piece, estate and gift tax. So this is pretty major, right? Because if the TCJA sunsets, we're gonna see some major changes to the estate tax exclusion. So, Julian, what do you see? I guess, well, first explain what those changes would be, but what are some other, I guess, ways that this can impact, everyday folks?
Yep. So just to cover it high level, Republicans would like to keep the exemption where it is and extend that. And Democrats would like to see it closed, bringing it down much lower to even, as low as 3 million per individual. So right now it's pretty high. It's at 13.61 million per person in 2024. That means for a couple, it's right around 27 million. If it drops in half and goes down to 6 without any intervention from Congress, that means that upon your passing, if you have over $6 million, it does get hit with the estate tax. Now, that doesn't affect most people, right? We're very well aware of that. But if you're in that bucket, you want to make sure that you are doing proactive tax planning whether that be gifting to the next generation or setting up trust and estate planning with a lawyer, which you should do regardless of where you're at, and really taking advantage of that. You do have the ability, right, for those with well beyond 27 million to essentially take advantage of that in full now and gift, 13.61 million per person. And then when it does reduce, your gift has already been made. So it's already set in stone. I know that can be a little bit confusing. Jacky, what would you add there?
Yeah, I mean that nothing really add there, just more so if the exclusion is so high, take advantage of it now. One thing is they're not going to take it back, right? If you gift beyond that 6 million, if it sunsets, they're not going to roll. The IRS isn't going to roll that back. So take advantage if you can. We've been helping some of the families we serve just gifting to kids or grandkids. So that's just something to think of. But it's a big drop, 13 million down to 6 million, and that really kind of almost doubles or triples the amount of people that would have a state tax.
Absolutely. And it going down, right? You may agree with, you may not agree with, but either way, the estate tax hits as high as 40%. So for those it impacts, which we understand as a minority of folks, it impacts greatly. Where if you are not doing tax planning, if you are not essentially have your estate set up appropriately, and you have $4 million over the future limit, let's say you have $16 million, that's a pretty big tax bill, right? That could be $2 million to the government. So you want to make sure it goes to who you want with intention, or whether that be nonprofits, children, education, whatever it may be. But you want it to be effective going where you want, as opposed to going to what somebody else wants.
And also, this is just a shameless plug. If you have someone you care about, assets you care about, make sure you do estate planning. Estate planning is not only for the wealthy. Just going to plug that. Anyway, moving right along. Next thing is, business tax rates and corporate policies. So this is a big one as well. Currently, under the TCJA, the current tax rate is flat at 21%, which is down from previously 35. But if it sunsets, we might see it increase, right?
Correct. So 14% cut, if you're looking at the flat numbers, 35 to 21. So they play a huge role in the economy. It doesn't affect most of us, right? Because we don't necessarily see the corporation and see that cut down. But from a tax perspective, from a stock perspective, right, when that gets cut, companies are more profitable. They can pay out more in dividends. They can reinvest more into the company. They can buy back more stock. A lot of optionality comes into play when 14% less of your profits go to the government. So looking at it, they saw that as a way to stimulate growth. It doesn't mean it will be there forever. But as we've spoken about on the past two components, the Democratic administration would like to see that sunset and increase to 28 and then potentially to 35, whereas the Republican side would like to see it be lower. And their view is that it trickles down, right? If corporations are paying less in tax, that means that they can pay people more, spend more on other areas of the economy and create more growth, which benefits all. Whereas the Democrats say, well, give us the 14%. And we will use that to stimulate the economy ourselves and give money to folks who need it. So for small business owners, it can affect a lot of deductions and credits, but it's going to change, and it depends on who is in charge.
Yeah, that's a good point. In summary, and let's talk about the risks, right? So, trying to be as neutral here. We read a lot of data. A lot of folks kind of, the big eggheads of the markets have ran all types of scenarios based on both of the candidates' plans. Let's talk about the risks based off each plan. So do you want to take Harris administration and just walk us through what risks from that plan?
Absolutely. And this is directly from our research partners at Goldman Sachs. So when you look at a potential Harris administration, biggest risk for markets is an increase in the corporate tax rate. However, in their view, in our view, given how close the House and Senate will be in terms of the race and the numbers needed to pass anything, an increase is unlikely because with a probability near zero that Republicans control even one chamber, right? It's very low. So if Democrats sweep, moderate senators are not going to agree to an increase in corporate tax rate. At the same time, tax cuts for wealthy households will probably not be renewed, right? So if Democrats do well, they're not necessarily going to give out tax breaks. It's not rocket science. At the same time, any deficit reduction from that side may likely be eaten up by expansion of the child tax credit. So there's a lot of nuance there, but the biggest risk is that the corporate tax rate increases. Any additions, Jacky?
No, I think you did a pretty good job summing that up. Yeah, I think, and if we were to boil it down, and obviously we're oversimplifying, right? Because we don't want to get into the weeds here, is for the Harris administration, it's the tax risk, right, for corporate taxers. For the Trump administration, the biggest risk isn't tax policy. There's actually been talks, and we say talks a lot because there's what's written, right, what the written proposal and what they say when they're out there campaigning. So you got to take that with a grain of salt. But there are talks of him bringing the corporate rate that tax lower to 15%, right, which is music to any investor's ears usually. But instead, the big risk would be the expansion of the tariffs, right? And we see this can renew trade wars. It could impact capital expenditures and also like just the production side of the company, as we saw back in 2018. So that is kind of like the bigger risk on the Trump side, not really taxes, but I guess more kind of like that foreign investment policy, so to speak.
Exactly. And for reference, a tariff is a tax by the government on an imported good. So, for example, Volkswagen sends over some cars. The Trump narrative as of late has been that he would increase taxes on that, thus increasing the cost on that. And he says he would offset that by cutting taxes in other areas, and essentially, other countries would pay for that. Doesn't make it right, but I always address this because what happens is my wife Angela asked me financial topics. She asked me questions about obscure financial topics about 3 weeks after we talked about them. So not an avid listener, but maybe one day she will be. Maybe one day she will be.
Yeah, we should talk about that because, the listening ship, I'm going on a side trip. I would wish, speaking of your wife and my wife, same thing. You think they'd be the biggest supporters, but I guess they hear us talk about it all the time in real life, so they probably just don't care to listen to us on a podcast. So we'll see. But Angela should be listening.
So taking a look at it, what should investors do? What comes to mind as we come up into the election next week and beyond? What should investors be taking advantage of?
So the first thing, let's talk about an executive summary of what action items. The first thing, above all, as we always like to say, is block out the noise, right? We talked about it before, so we're not going to circle this again, but elections don't typically impact markets long term. The volatility is typically from the uncertainty. So don't make any crazy adverse investment moves or anything based on who you think is going to win or what's going to happen, right? Stay the course. But first is I would say review what Roth conversions, right? Income tax brackets might be higher. So if you're in a position to take advantage of that now, you should definitely consider it. Definitely depends on your situation, but Roth conversion. What else, Julian?
For those nearing retirement or looking on taking out sizable withdrawals, take a look at the timing of selling assets and consider the potential impact of capital gains increases. All right, so spreading out sales over multiple years, using trusts, using gifting to help offset some taxes in the future if that changes. So we don't expect to change now, but if that starts to be talked about, you will start seeing momentum in the markets as folks look to take advantage of lower tax rates that exist now on capital gains.
Yep, that's a good point as well. And another is asset location, which I guess is not really talked about. But if you are someone who takes advantage of high income dividends and interest, if possible, right, putting those in more tax advantage accounts, right? So if you're receiving investments that have high income and they're being reinvested and you're not really taking that income, see if you can shift those in tax advantage accounts where you're not paying taxes on it throughout the year, especially if we might see those tax brackets increase.
Absolutely. And I would add, as we go through this, always have your estate planning in order, regardless of what your assets look like, whether you have $50 or $50 million. You do want it to go seamlessly from you to whoever you wish, right? In whatever fashion you would like. But if you don't have an estate plan, it goes through probate, and it's a real hassle to have things go through probate, go through the court system, and it's expensive. So you want to make sure that it goes directly from you to your beneficiaries in the most seamless way possible, with as little tax as possible.
And that's a good point. And I'm gonna quote you again, Julian. You said on a podcast, I don't remember when, the government has an estate plan for you. So,
They do. Yes, they
so,
do.
so do you want the government to decide where your assets go, or do you want to decide? So, yeah, but that's pretty
Or
much it.
your not only the government, but your random third cousin that comes out of the woodwork and wants a little piece. He wants a little piece, and they'll litigate, because if it's not written down, or you didn't specifically exclude somebody that maybe you are not close to, folks come out of the woodwork, and we all have either a friend that has gone through that or family who's gone through that. And if not, we likely will.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Actually, I read a statistic. It's usually siblings is the most common uh battle in estate planning, where it was supposed to be left equal and one sibling fights. So, just saying, get an estate plan done, eliminate that.
Exactly. And it happens with money. It also happens with objects,
Mhm.
jewelry, whatever it may be. Mom wanted me to have this. Dad wanted me to have this. Did he write it down? No, he should have written it down. Because then, even if it is correct, it does create some tension there. But obviously, that's a whole different topic. It's a little scary, not to bring everybody down, but best to write it down, right? Because if that makes you nervous, you should just write it down, and it'll be done. Best way to alleviate the tension is just do the job.
So I guess that's it for episode 12. Again, a big day in a couple days if you're listening today. Block out the noise, right? Uh, Whoever wins wins, and long term, the markets do not get impacted by presidential candidates. So do not abandon your long term goals and investment strategy for short term events. Before we close out, anything else to add, Julian?
Buckle up. Election season, always the worst season, not because of the markets, but because when I watched the Phillies lose this year, not only was the game awful, the commercials were worse. So buckle up, and keep in mind, 160 million or so Americans will vote. It generally is pretty close. So whichever team you're on, there's 80 million Americans on the other side. So, we're all in this together, and try not to get too emotional because it's a crazy time. It's bad enough. It's bad enough.
All right, everybody. So remember, it's us against the problem, right? Not against each other. So sign off. Thank you all listening to episode 12 of Inevitable Wealth. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.